What is the self? What does it mean to say that a particular system or a particular object has a self? How's the self different from consciousness? And what does it mean to say that a particular being or object has self-consciousness? These and some other questions hopefully I'll be addressing in some depth in this video, and this is part of my Consciousness as an Illusion series, or Consciousness as Illusory series, so maybe you'll be able to sort of guess where I'm going to go from this, but only because you're taking the intentional stance, which I'll go into in some further detail. Now, the self has a number of distinctive features which can at first be quite mysterious, and indeed are quite mysterious. The first attribute is, of course, the self has this underlying spatio-temporal unity. The spatio-unity, or spatial unity, comes from the different regions of the brain. Indeed, the different regions of the body and the nervous system and the limbs and the different perceptions all appear to be happening on this self. And indeed, all the self also has the temporal unity, because I am the same self that I was yesterday, or at least that's the way it appears to me. Only this can't possibly be the case, because, as I've discussed before, the self is a fluid system. There's no particular atoms which are constant. It remains in flux, and indeed has to remain in flux in order for it to function. It has a dialectical nature with other selves in its environment, so the self is not a static unity as we often perceive it to be. But this is not the only mystery of the self. Why should such an illusion of unity even come into being in the first place? Well, personally, I believe it's somewhat of a evolutionary advantage, and secondly that it's a social construction. Now, when I say it's an evolutionary advantage, I'm referring really to Dennett's work in the intentional stance here. Now, the intentional stance is a particular stance that we take in order to make sense of the world. Evolution often takes shortcuts to provide an evolutionary advantage. Now, it's only a Laplacian paradise which would allow any given object or system to calculate with mathematical and physical certainty the rest of the future. And because we are beings of finite and limited knowledge, this is not a viable strategy in order to calculate such complex beings as other selves and indeed other animals. So the intentional stance is where we attribute beliefs, desires and intentions to other agents or other systems which can yield predictable behavior. It's not always right, but evolution doesn't work on the principle of 100% accuracy, 100% efficiency. It works on slow adaptation, it works on making particular shortcuts in order to exploit particular niches in the environment. So when we say that something has a self, we mean that we can take the intentional stance and attribute certain beliefs, desires and intentions to another system in order to yield quite good predictions of its future behavior. Now this obviously works because we're social creatures, and it's a necessary advantage for us to have this. It's also necessary for us to be able to hunt. If we can predict where other animals are going to go, we can hunt them more effectively, and so on. So the intentional stance is part biological, but the self is also part social. It changes across cultures, and it changes across time. There have been many different connotations of the self, many different ideas regarding the self. For example, Eastern thought maintains quite a lot of the time that the self, as I have discussed, is somewhat of an illusion. On the other hand, our westernized, individualistic, highly autonomous consensus holds that the self is a real thing. The individual can be atomized. there's a few interesting documentaries on this. I would suggest watching Century of the Self, and then also if you can find some of Foucault's discussions of the self. He did a few lectures many years ago which are certainly very interesting on this subject. So there are a few aspects of the self which hopefully I've shed some light on. Now, the other aspect, which rather ties into this, is that I can never be wrong when I refer to myself. I can't make an error in reference or misidentification. For example, if I said, I am feeling in pain, I could not possibly be wrong in regards to who was feeling in pain. However, if I said that this is a cup, you might agree with me, but there would be some circumstances when that particular reference would fail. Now, Shoemaker has it that because identification goes hand in hand with the possibility of misidentification, then the self cannot be some sort of identifying act. We don't perceive the self as an object. His conclusion is that because of this, the self isn't a reference at all. It's not referring to anything. When we say I, we might, for example, be referring or using an anchor to that person, but when he says I am in pain, he's not specifically referring to anything other than what the system's actually performing. So this leads me to probably my final point, which is the self is a metaphysical nightmare. But you know, there are many examples which make this issue even more complicated. People with split brain, where their left and right hemisphere are detached, the corpus callosum between them is detached, so there's no or little, very little communication between the two hemispheres. In this case, the different hemispheres can actually have different beliefs. This is slightly different but somewhat related to, obviously, multiple personality disorder, which isn't obviously any neurophysical damage, but is a psychological disorder, where again many selves inhabit the same body and share the same brain. But two selves occupying one brain is no more metaphysically complex than one self occupying the same brain. The self is not, it's not a thing, as we've discussed previously, but neither can it be separated from its environment. Alan Watts talks about the skin encapsulated ego. Peter Russell talks about the emergence of global consciousness, and many other thinkers such as Heisenberg hold that multiplicity is only apparent. In truth, there is only one mind. So I think much is needed to dispel this illusion of the self. Certainly we have to have some autonomy, but when we see the self as cut off and detached from the rest of the world, I think we really do everyone a lot of damage through this respect. It means that we don't have enough respect for other people, it means we don't have enough respect for the environment, and it means that ultimately we are destroying everything that the self is, which is a unified part of existence as a whole. So I hope to hear some comments back on this. I know I've been a little bit metaphysical here, so I'm sure I'll hear some angry criticisms, but I hope to hear them. Peace.